Welcome to the Richard Nixon Library. I'm Bill Baribault, the president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, the organization that built this marvelous complex 25 years ago, and we're leading the charge to build the new Nixon Library. Today marks President Nixon's 103rd birthday, an important event in American history that we commemorate every year. He began his memoirs with the phrase, "I was born in a house my father built." That house is right behind you. He lived in a small bedroom upstairs with his brothers. Richard Nixon rose from this farmhouse in modest beginnings to the White House to become President of the United States. As he said often, "I believe in the American dream because it came true in my own life." Today we commemorate that remarkable life. I'd like to introduce some board members and friends of the Nixon Foundation today, and many of you are here, and the list is long, and I don't want to leave anyone out. Karl Rove, the architect, Fox News contributor and former White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and his wife, Karen. Ed Nixon, President Nixon's brother and Foundation board member, and his daughter, Beth. Christopher Cox, the grandson of the President, Christiopher Nixon Cox, and Ed Cox's son. Jim and Esther Kavanaugh, board member and two indispensable friends of the Nixon Foundation. John Barr, every organization has its treasurer. Thank you, John Barr. I'd like to honor Sandy Quinn, who's caught up on the freeway. We understand he would understand moving ahead with the program. He's the former president of the foundation. Fred Whitaker, chairman of the Orange County Republican Party and an Orange City councilman. Loie Gaunt and Marge Acker, two of Richard and Pat Nixon's truest confidants, whose services with Richard Nixon date to his time in the U.S. Senate. Colonel Jack Brennan, President Nixon's Marine military aide and Chief of Staff. Jeff Shepard, Associate Director of the White House Domestic Council and friend of the Nixon Foundation. John Carlson, Assistant Press Secretary of the Nixon White House. John Pitches, a Nixon White House advance man, and his wife, Wendy. David Grant, General Manager of South Coast Plaza and a Nixon Foundation friend, and Werner Herscher, Executive Director of Domestic and International Markets at South Coast Plaza. We worked with Werner in South Coast in 2008 and again in 2011 to commemorate Ping Pong Diplomacy, the first American-Chinese initiative dating back to 1971. Hank Pereira, President of Pereira Construction, which is building the new Nixon Library, and his wife, Mary. Russ Colvin, a longtime Nixon friend and supporter. Sherry Harrington, also a longtime friend and Nixon supporter. Steve Alexson, Nixon Foundation friend and supporter. Lois Lundberg, Chairman Emeritus of the Orange County Republican Party. And from the city of Yorba Linda, we have the Mayor Tom Lindsay and Councilman Gene Hernandez and Craig Young. So thank you all. And we certainly appreciate everyone that's attending this today. President Nixon, joined by President Ford, President Reagan, and President Bush, dedicated the Nixon Library on July 19, 1990. Today, you are going to help us launch construction of the new Nixon Library. I'd like to ask Christopher Cox to say a few words and officially launch the construction.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you for all the good work that you're doing at the foundation and to bring my grandparents' story to a new generation. And thank you all for being here today. This day is a milestone in the history of the Nixon Library and for the Nixon legacy. And I'll explain why in a minute, but just as a quick preview, I'm not going to use any paper to give this speech, and I'm not going to use a teleprompter. Carl, that was for you. Instead, I'm going to use an iPhone. So we're going to up our technological game by using this iPhone today. So that's a little preview of what's to come later in my speech. But first, a few recollections about my grandfather. In 1945, my grandfather, only months after returning home from naval service in World War II, received a letter from a Whittier businessman named Herman Perry, the father of Hubert Perry, who's actually on the foundation board. Mr. Perry asked my grandfather if he would like to be a candidate for Congress on the Republican ticket in 1946. My grandparents weighed the decision together and were captivated by the promise of what could come. It took them less than 48 hours to respond yes. In that election 70 years ago this year, Richard Nixon, a 33-year-old war veteran with virtually no political experience, soundly unseated a 5-term incumbent to launch his career in politics. It was his entry into the arena, as he liked to say. During his 5 decades in the arena, my grandfather enjoyed many victories and suffered a few defeats. But his story was emblematic of the American story, of the promise of America and the American dream. The esteemed presidential historian, Richard Norton Smith, said just last year at this very library that the silent majority identified with Richard Nixon throughout his life and career because he gave voice to their values. Several of you here today were by his side during those 5 decades in the arena, and maybe several others met him, or my grandmother, or maybe he inspired you as he inspired millions. And that's just another reason why this day is so special. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to represent the Nixon family and to join Foundation board members and members of my grandfather's administration and all of you here today as we officially launch construction on the new Nixon Library. The promise of what this library will be is phenomenal. Visitors will be able to experience a dramatic presentation of Richard Nixon's very dramatic life and understand how consequential his life and his presidency are to us and to the world today. The old museum, which I was among the first to tour with my parents and grandparents and 3 other presidents on opening day 25 years ago, accomplished that goal. But while that museum and those exhibits within that museum were informative and very well done, over 2 decades of advancement in technology and the release of millions of documents and artifacts allows for a substantive examination of Richard Nixon's life, presidency, and legacy, which is exactly what this new library will do. The efforts of the Foundation and National Archives teams to give this museum a complete renovation, to tell my grandparents' story by using modern technologies and engaging students, scholars, and the public with participatory learning opportunities, will bring American history and American civics to an entirely new generation and allow them to experience both in ways in which they are used to. Thanks to these and other exciting and ongoing efforts, I have no doubt that visitors here and visitors to the new online Nixon Library Museum will appreciate all that Richard and Pat Nixon stood for and accomplished and learn from their stories. So now I'm going to need all of your help. This is actually a lifelong childhood dream of mine to become a construction worker. So I would like to invite several people up to the stage. I know Sandy Quinn is still traveling here to the library, but John Barr, Karl Rove, Ed Nixon, Bill Barabalt, Jim and Esther Kavanaugh, and Mayor Lindsay. Would you please come to the stage? All right. We're ready.
I remember a speech Mr. Secretary I made last time. He said he's an accident pro, so I'm glad we have these cards.
And luckily, President Reagan gave me a pass on that, so you can all find that in the library, that letter. Ready? All right, I think we're ready. So we're going to launch construction on this project. I'll lead the countdown. As I get to 1, the crews standing by in the library's galleries to your right will begin bringing this library museum into the 21st century. So help me count down. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, they warned me. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, please join us opening weekend for the opening of the new Nixon Library, which will be on October 14th and 15th, 2016. Please come back soon, and thank you very much.
So we actually tried to get the real jackhammers, but our president of our construction company said maybe the sound will be better. Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to report a bit on the success of the Richard Nixon Centennial Legacy Campaign. The individuals and companies that are listed on the wall behind me made it possible 25 years ago to build a center in honor of President and Mrs. Nixon, to tell their story, to tell our American story, and to further their legacies and champion the causes to which they dedicated their lives. In the same spirit, the Richard Nixon Centennial Legacy Campaign was launched to create a new Nixon Library. Our monies raised through the campaign are funding this renovation known as Phase 1. As Chris said, those efforts will culminate in a grand style on October 14th of this year. Today we launch Phase 2, developing and expanding programs that inspire civic engagement and invigorate students from elementary to high school and beyond to become more involved in their communities, their states, and their country. These endeavors will be accomplished in 4 parts: digital research, learning and scholarship, civic engagement, leadership education, launching and sustaining new initiatives in academia, and expanded library public programming. Thanks to the extraordinarily generous private contributors, many of which are here today, and thanks to our chairman, Fred Malek, we have raised 75% of our goal of $25 million. But we need your help to raise the last quarter. It is all about education, making the Nixon story relevant and inspiring to young people, to millennials, to those who may not appreciate our history, and to encourage forward progress on the initiatives that President Nixon began over 40 years ago. Please visit the nixonfoundation.org website to see how you can help us to reach those goals. We'll see you all back on October 14th for the opening of the new Nixon Library, and we can't wait. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us outside at President and Mrs. Nixon's memorials at 11 a.m., just a few minutes, and for the wreath-laying ceremony with a wreath sent from President Obama. Thank you.